Okay, section 5.5, isolating absolute values. So in the previous section, we solved absolute value, two-step absolute value equations. So this is similar to what we did, only now the absolute value will not be isolated, meaning it won't be by itself. So we're going to follow these steps to solve an absolute value equation which contains one absolute value. The first thing that we want to do is isolate the absolute value on one side of the equation. So we want to get the absolute value alone. It's very important that we do this before we separate the two equations. Then the question asks, is the number on the other side of the equation negative? So once we've isolated, if we have the absolute value set equal to a negative number, then the equation has no solution. If no, it's positive, then we can go on to this next step. So this next step is to write the two equations without the absolute value. The first equation will set the quantity inside the absolute value bars equal to the number on the other side of the equal sign. The second equation will set the quantity inside the bars equal to the opposite of the number on the other side. Then we're going to solve these two equations. We will end up with two solutions that we are going to write inside of our set braces. Remember our set braces from yesterday, we put both of our solutions inside the set braces. So let's take a look at example number 1. Notice that this 10 is sitting right next to the absolute value. We need to get the absolute value by itself. Since the 10 is sitting right next to the absolute value, that means it's being multiplied to the absolute value. So the opposite of multiplying would be to divide. So we need to divide both sides of this equation by 10 as our first step. So we have absolute value of negative 10n is equal to 100 divided by 10, which is 10. Now that we have the absolute value by itself, let's go ahead and separate into two equations. Negative 10n equals 10, and negative 10n equals negative 10. And let's solve each one of these. So dividing by negative 10, n equals negative 1. Dividing by negative 10 on the second equation gives us n is equal to positive 1. So go ahead and place both our solutions of negative 1 and positive 1 inside the set braces. Just put a comma in between those. Alright, number 2, let's get the absolute value by itself. So add 2 to both sides of the equation. So we have absolute value of a divided by 7 is equal to 1. From here, we can go ahead and separate this equation into two separate equations. A divided by 7 equals 1, and a divided by 7 equals negative 1. To solve this, we would multiply both sides of the equation by 7. So a is equal to 7. For the second equation, a is equal to negative 7. So you'll notice that sometimes we're ending up with just the positive and the negative version of that number, but it won't always be the case. The order that you write these answers does not matter. Number 3, to get the absolute value by itself, we need to add 5 to both sides. So we have absolute value of negative 2 plus n is equal to 0. Now 0 is not a negative number, so we can keep going. The only thing is we can't separate it into two equations because we can't have a negative 0. That would be the same as just 0. So we will separate it into one equation. Negative 2 plus n is equal to 0. Adding 2 to both sides of the equation, n is equal to 2. We could just leave our answer as n is equal to 2, or we could just put that one solution inside of the set braces. For number 4, notice this 6 is added to the absolute value. So to get rid of this 6, make sure you're not dividing. The opposite of adding 6 would be subtracting 6 from both sides of the equation. So we have absolute value of 2x plus 5 is equal to negative 21. Now this is now going to fall into up here where it says on the second bullet point, is the number on the other side of the equation negative? So if you'll notice, the number on the other side of the absolute value is negative, and that's after we've isolated it. So we can stop right here. We can't have the absolute value of any expression equal to a negative number. So there will be no solution for this particular problem. Okay, flip over the page. Let's look at number 5. To get the absolute value by itself, we need to get rid of this 6. Since the 6 is divided, the opposite of division would be multiply. So let's multiply both sides of this equation by 6. So we're left with the absolute value of a subtract 5 is equal to 4 times 6, which is 24. From here we can separate this into two separate equations. A subtract 5 equals 24, and a subtract 5 equals negative 24. Adding 5 to both sides, a is equal to 29, and adding 5 to both sides on the second equation, a is equal to negative 19. So our two solutions are 29 and negative 19. We'll put those in the set braces. For number 6, in order to get the absolute value by itself, we need to get rid of this subtracting 7. The opposite would be adding 7. So we have absolute value of 1 plus 2n is equal to 7. Let's go ahead and separate this into 1 plus 2n equals 7. And 1 plus 2n equals negative 7. Solving each one of these by subtracting 1 and then dividing by 2, n is equal to 3, subtracting 1 and dividing by 2 on the second equation gives us n is equal to negative 4. So our two solutions are 3 and negative 4. Okay, down to number 7. So this one can be a little bit tricky. What you don't want to do is try to take 3 subtract 8, because that's not following order of operations. Remember, when we solve equations, we kind of use the backwards of order of operations. This negative 8 is sitting right next to the absolute value, which means it's being multiplied. We have to do that second. First, we need to get rid of this plus 3. So let's go ahead and subtract 3 as our very first step. So we have negative 8, absolute value, negative 3m minus 2, close the absolute value, equals 24. Now we can go ahead and get rid of the negative 8. Since it's being multiplied, we do the opposite, which is dividing by negative 8. So we have absolute value of 3m subtract 2 is equal to 24 divided by negative 8, which is negative 3. So at this point, we take a look at the right-hand side of the equation, and this absolute value is set equal to a negative number. That tells us we have a no solution. Over on number 8, we need to get rid of the negative 3 as our first step. Since it's sitting right next to the absolute values, remember that means to multiply. The opposite of that would be to divide. So let's go ahead and divide negative 102 by negative 3 to give us a positive 34. On the left-hand side, we have negative 4b subtract 2, and that's in absolute value still. From here, we can go ahead and separate into two equations. Negative 4b subtract 2 equals 34, and negative 4b subtract 2 equals a negative 34. Adding 2 to both sides, dividing by negative 4, I'm getting b is equal to negative 9 for that first solution. On the second equation, adding 2 to both sides, and dividing by negative 4, b is equal to a positive 8. So our two solutions are negative 9 and positive 8 that we're going to place inside our set braces. All right, let's come down to number 9. So there are two things that we need to get rid of in order for the absolute value to be by itself. The 6 and the 4. And we always start with either adding or subtracting numbers from both sides. So we would subtract this plus 4 from both sides as our first step. 6 absolute value of negative 3n plus 6 is equal to 18. Now we can go ahead and get rid of the 6 by dividing both sides by 6. Negative 3n plus 6 in absolute value is equal to 3. So let's go ahead and separate into two equations. Negative 3n plus 6 equals 3, and negative 3n plus 6 equals negative 3. Subtracting 6 from both sides and dividing by a negative 3, n is equal to 1, and then subtracting 6 from both sides and dividing by a negative 3 again for our second equation, n is equal to 3. So our two solutions are positive 1 and positive 3. All right, our last problem, number 10. So this is another one of those tricky ones where you cannot just take 9, subtract 4, because that's not following order of operations. So first let's get rid of this plus 9. So subtract 9 from both sides, so negative 4 absolute value, negative 10n minus 5 is equal to negative 20. Then we can divide both sides by negative 4. So absolute value of negative 10n minus 5 is equal to a positive 5. From here, let's separate this equation into two separate equations. Negative 10n minus 5 equals positive 5, and negative 10n minus 5 is equal to negative 5. Adding 5 to both sides and dividing by 10, n is equal to, dividing by a negative 10, n is equal to negative 1 for the left-hand side. On the right-hand side, negative 10n is equal to 0, so dividing both sides by negative 10, n is equal to 0. So our two solutions are n is equal to negative 1 and n is equal to 0.